that you want. Hello? I gotta turn this on. Hello? Oh, that works. Let me just welcome you all. Congresswoman Nidia Velazquez and I have read an important document that has been written by the former governor of Puerto Rico, the former resident commissioner. He was our colleague here. And we thought that it was of such relevance and so different and unique that we wanted an opportunity for him to come and share it. So he is here at Congresswoman Velazquez and my invitation to be here, and I think you're in for quite a treat because we've heard a lot about Puerto Rico, but I think he's going to bring a very... Hi, Congressman. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. You're so sweet. Thank you so much. Let me just say this, and then I'm going to pass the mic on to Nidia. Aníbal, his wife, Piti Candara, is here, the state representative from Puerto Rico. Thank you, Piti, for being here with us. And we have the president of the Senate of Puerto Rico, Eduardo Batia. And before Eduardo Batia was elected Senate, we shared a jail cell together, along with a few other people. And today there are people living with a little more freedom, a little more decency on the island of Vieques. So that's always the context. He's always my president of the Senate, but he's also my compañero de lucha cuando viene a Vieques. So it's good to see you here. And I just want to say, so I think it's going to be a delight. I'm not going to go into what it's like, who wants to hear the plot of the movie before we get the real thing? So we're not going to get into that. But I just want to say a few words about Aníbal. I think that he brings a great, new, innovative perspective, which should be heard on the issue of Puerto Rico. A perspective that does not simply say that that the hedge funds are the people that are going to manage the history of the people of Puerto Rico. That there should be other avenues, and that the responsibility for the future of Puerto Rico rests here in the Congress of the United States and with the people of Puerto Rico. Together, we must resolve that. He's been a great friend of mine, a great former governor, great former resident commissioner, and we've fought together on so many issues. And I know that together, we're eventually, one day, going to get Oscar Lopez Rivera out of jail together. And I know his commitment to all of those struggles. So, Aníbal, it's a pleasure to have you back speaking at the podium here in the Congress of the United States after a small vacation from here. Now, you can't say anything, there's no words to introduce her, so simply say she's my compañera de lucha, and I'm so happy that she's here with us. And Congresswoman Nidia Velazquez, give her a round of applause.
Our colleague, thank you so much for being here. And let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for being here today. You know, if there is anything important that I want each and every one to take with you when you leave this room, is the fact that we are dealing with a fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico that is not only the responsibility of the people of Puerto Rico, but it's also the moral responsibility of the U.S. government. That we have 3.5 million American citizens who live in the island of Puerto Rico. And today, and just recently as last year, the governor of Puerto Rico stated that the public debt of Puerto Rico is unpayable. And so, we have been holding hearings, and tomorrow we will be holding 2 more hearings for, I believe, 12 hearings so far this year. So we are at a crossroad. We will be holding a hearing in the Natural Resources Committee and another one on the Financial Services Committee to seek a legislative solution. And we have the Congress of the United States cannot turn the back on the people of Puerto Rico, the 3.5 million Americans. That the United States Congress and the United States federal government bears responsibility about the current crisis. When we give Puerto Rico back in 936, 20 years, an instrument for economic growth, and say, here you have, we are going to incentivize for pharma technology companies to come to Puerto Rico and create jobs, and then 20 years later, repeal 936 without providing any other tool for sustained economic growth. And so, of course, that when we were facing an economic crisis here in 2008, 2009, Puerto Rico was in a deep recession 10 years later, 10 years earlier. And so, what do we have? That 10% of the people in Puerto Rico have left the island. That today we have 1.2 million Puerto Ricans living in Florida. And 150 schools that have been closed in Puerto Rico. That 35,000 doctors have left the island in Puerto Rico. The government of Puerto Rico cannot pay. And so we have to seek real solutions. And tomorrow, after tomorrow, there are two things that we must accomplish. One is to give Puerto Rico the tools to restructure its public debt, and has to be more than just Chapter 9. And two, how do we accomplish that in terms of not undermining the autonomy of Puerto Rico? And whatever oversight board we put together, whatever oversight discussion happens here, it has to respect those who were elected democratically by the people of Puerto Rico. So our governor and colleague has a perspective as to the responsibility of the federal government as it relates to Puerto Rico. And it's an intriguing one, and something that is that we should listen to, and that we should consider and see how that brings into the whole discussion of looking for solutions that will bring fairness and justice to the 3.5 million Americans who live in Puerto Rico. Thank you.
So we're going to welcome now our former colleague, Aníbal Acevedo. And afterwards, there'll be a Q&A. So welcome to the
Thank you, thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. First, I want to thank media and Luis for hosting this event and for the invitation to speak to you on this issue. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's a pleasure to see you again, my good friend, President Jimmy Duncan. It was very helpful when I was here serving in Congress. I actually took him to walk through the Caño Martín Peña, which was still struggling with that, but there's some positive movement forward. I have a presentation which is based on a law review article that I submitted to the University of Puerto Rico Law Review. It's available online. I'm not going to read the whole article, but it's a presentation that needs some historical and legal background. Some here are Puerto Rican, and if you're Puerto Rican, you're an expert about Puerto Rico, because we all are experts about Puerto Rico. So maybe some of the things I will say are familiar to you, but of course, there's a broader audience, and I want to put it in the right perspective, because to understand where we are today, where we should go, and what are the risks we have, we need to understand how we came to where we are. And you know, I've been talking about the debt crisis since August of 2014. At that time, I realized that yes, the day was going to come that Puerto Rico was going to be unable to pay debt. At that time, I published an essay over there, a book about that time. I said that the solution had to include the United States to come to the table, that the crisis was not a cyclical crisis, that basically it's a structural crisis. 2 years after, the crisis is here, and we're already defaulting some bonds, and if nothing happens in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, we're going to go on a huge, big default around the summer of this year. So how we got here? We need to understand what's the political, constitutional relationship that Puerto Rico has had with the United States in 1898. And I'm just going to summarize 4 principles, which that doesn't mean everybody has to agree with them, but in a sense I want to make them non-controversial, but to understand again where we are. The first one, from the start, from 1898, the official position of the government of the United States until 1952, was to slowly grant Puerto Rico more self-government. Fort Accord Act in 1900, Jones Act in 1917, the Elected Governor Act of 1948. Those were movement towards granting Puerto Rico more self-government, and of course, the enactment of the Commonwealth Status and the Commonwealth Constitution in 1952 was a huge step forward. So the official public policy of the United States was to grant Puerto Rico more self-government, at least until 1950. Because since then on, we haven't obtained any more self-government powers. Second, this might be controversial, but statehood for Puerto Rico has never been the official position of the United States. I'm not saying that it might become the official position of the United States in the future. I'm saying that all the steps taken by the U.S. government since 1898, they made it clear that Puerto Rico was not going toward the path of statehood. When you hear about the insular cases, I'm not going to bore you about that, but the insular cases came up, why? Because after 1888, the United States realized that for the first time, they had control of territories, basically Puerto Rico, Guam, and Philippines, that for the first time, the United States decided they are not going to become a state. Totally contrary to Alaska, Hawaii, and of course all the other territories. On the other territories, from the beginning, everybody knew that at some time they were going to become a state. So the United States had the constitutional theory based on the territorial clause of incorporated territory, which means I own you, you're part of me, and someday you're going to become a state. And they realized Puerto Rico was not going to go on that path, the same as Guam and Philippines. They came up with a new theory, and that's the insular cases, non-incorporated territories. If you read the Constitution, there's nothing there that says non-incorporated territory. It talks about territory. So from then on, from 1902, validated until today, Puerto Rico, Guam, and of course Philippines obtained its independence later on, are what is called non-incorporated territory, and the reason for that was because they were not going on the path towards statehood. Again, that can be changed in the future. Third, the creation of Commonwealth in 1952, yes, was a huge step forward. For the first time, we had a fully democratic government for our own businesses, our own constitution drafted by the people of Puerto Rico, approved by the people of Puerto Rico and Congress. So it was a move forward. But the language, the debates, everything that happened at that time led the door open to perhaps the legal controversy that we have today. And then I have to say that the post-1952 period had a brief period in which the official position of the United States was that something really important happened in 1950. The U.S. went to the United Nations and told the United Nations Puerto Rico was no longer a colony, it was a self-government entity, and moved Puerto Rico from the list of colonies under the United States. And there's some Supreme Court cases that talk about Puerto Rico has a unique, special relationship with the United States and all that. But nevertheless, number one, the insular cases were never revoked. And number two, which I mentioned in the first one, no more self-government powers have been granted to Puerto Rico since 1952. And the problem is that what we have now on the table, which will be the last part of my presentation, is legislative vehicles, legislative proposals that for the first time will revoke the part of the self-government powers that Puerto Rico obtained. So we are right now in a situation where that first line, self-government was the official position of the United, more self-government, apparently it's going to be revoked. And that's really, really huge. So the reality is that 60 years after Commonwealth was enacted, we're in the middle of a financial and economic crisis, but at the same time, the underpinnings of the creation of Commonwealth are being denied, not by enemies of the Commonwealth status, by the official position of the United States. Then that was the historical background. Let's go in terms of the constitutional context in which Puerto Rico got into this difficult situation. I'm talking basically about the debt of more than $72 billion, which is the big controversy right now. If you go back to the Affordable Care Act and the Jones Act, which are the two pieces of legislation enacted by Congress in 1900 and 1970 to basically rule Puerto Rico, approved under the plenary powers that Congress has under the territorial clause. Over there you find many of the dispositions that are part of the legal controversy today. For example, that we had to have a balanced budget was there. That what happens if you cannot pay your debt was there. Rules adopted by Congress. And yes, since 1900 and late in 1917, Congress give the power to Puerto Rico to impose taxes, to collect those taxes, to sell bonds, and granted triple tax exemption to the bonds of Puerto Rico. That's the law from 1917. What happened in 1952? And this is very interesting. In 1952, when Congress approved Law 600, which is the basis for the Commonwealth status, Congress repealed many of the dispositions of the Jones Act. And now, for example, we have a mandate of a balanced budget, not because it's in the federal law, because it's in the Puerto Rico Constitution. We have the mandate, which is quite controversial, that you first have to pay the bondholders, then pay the police officers and doctors that work for the government of Puerto Rico. That used to be in the Jones Act. Now it's in the Puerto Rico Constitution. But, this is what I discovered. The power to impose taxes, to collect taxes, to sell bonds, that was included in the 1917 Jones Act, has never been repealed. Therefore, you can basically conclude that the power that we have today to impose taxes, to collect our own taxes, and under which we sold those $72 billion in bonds, comes not from the Puerto Rico Constitution, comes from federal law. Because it's the only explanation why they did repeal the other three dispositions dealing with the debt of Puerto Rico and constitutional principle related to the budget, but they did not repeal that one. So in terms of where we are now and what is the responsibility of the United States, I think it's very, very, very important to understand that. And on top of that, the triple tax exception. And this is very unique. Congress could not pass a law saying that if you buy bonds from New York, and you live in California, California won't be able to tax you on the revenues of those bonds. They could say bonds from the 50 states will be tax exempted, but they cannot handpick. In terms of Puerto Rico and the other territories, yes. Federal law says that if you're a resident of New York, and she has many bondholders over there, from New York, Wall Street, if you buy bonds from Puerto Rico, as opposed to if you buy bonds from California, Congress basically is mandating the state of New York, the city of New York, you cannot impose taxes on those bonds. So it's very important to understand how we got to the place where we are right now. And let's talk now about the moral, legal responsibility that the United States has with Puerto Rico. Let's be honest. More than a political or legal relationship, the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States has been based on economic and military interests. That's the truth. That's the truth. Sometimes for the good of Puerto Rico. Sometimes not necessarily for the good of Puerto Rico. And one of the big challenges we have right now is that I think no one in Washington has cleared what is the official position that we want toward Puerto Rico. I'm not talking about statehood, I'm not talking about independence, I'm not talking about sovereign commonwealth or whatever. We're no longer a military base. There's no longer a threat with Cuba. We're no longer, we're still an important market, but now with all the free trade, we're not the exclusive market for American goods. So one of the problems we have is that there is no official public policy in the United States how to deal with Puerto Rico. And then on top of that, yes, on this crisis, we have a lot of responsibility, and I take my share as former governor. I don't have no doubts, I don't have any problems with that. But there is a shared responsibility. Maybe I mentioned elimination of Section 936. That was the most, maybe you were in disagreement, but that was the most important economic tool for investment that Puerto Rico had. It was repealed in 1997. It had a 10-year phase out. Guess what? The last year was 2006, when our economic crisis and recession started in 2006. Back in 1998, we had 150,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector. Now we have only like 80,000. Even Senator Hatch the other day recognized that that was a mistake. So there is a shared responsibility. When you hear, and you're going to hear that a lot, oh, the problem is that the public sector in Puerto Rico is too big. You have to tell those who tell you that. Well, but the problem is also that the private sector is too small because of the decisions taken by Congress. So that's part of the problem. On top of that, yes, we have to comply with the rules of the most developed economy in the world, the US economy. And the truth is, we're still a developing economy. For many years, we thought we were a developed economy. We behaved like we were a developed economy. But no, if you see the numbers, we're still a developing economy. So if you impose the rules of the most developed economy to a developing economy, this is what you get. You cannot compete with your neighbors because the decisions taken here in Congress, and that's the way it has to be, is thinking about the US economy. And the reality of the Puerto Rico economy is completely different. So that's very important. And then if you add on top of that, for example, we have to comply with all the health standards established by the federal government. But we don't get it. We don't get the federal funding that the other jurisdictions get. So if you happen to go to a hospital in Puerto Rico, that hospital has to comply with all the federal standards. That doctor has to comply with all the federal regulations, standards, accreditations, that nurse, everyone. But the system in Puerto Rico is not getting the same amount of money that the system in Chicago, in New York, and other places is getting. So it's the combination of all those elements that, in a sense, makes a political and moral responsibility from the United States regarding the crisis we have in Puerto Rico. And don't forget, those 72 billion were sold in the municipal market, the most regulated market in the world. It's not that Puerto Rico was taking money, borrowing money from Saudi Arabia or places like that. No. And we had good grading from the credit agencies during all that time. The only emission that has been sold to the hedge funds completely was the last one because we were already junk bonds, the 3.2 billion. But all the other $69 billion was sold on the Wall Street market. Fairly evaluated by all the agencies. So in that sense, yes, we took more than we should. But you know why? Because it happened, the debt balloon, in the years that the official position of the federal government was what? To put easy money out there. Which was the reason for the mortgage crisis. Why did the federal government bail out the banks? Because they knew that in big part it was their responsibility. Because in order to move the economy, the Federal Reserve Bank had basically a zero interest rate to put money easily out there, and then the banks were lending money to people that they knew were not going to be able to pay, so it was a total circle. And when the crisis exploded, what did the federal government do? Okay, we have responsibility there. So in that sense, the crisis of Puerto Rico, even though this is 2016, not 2008, has the same origin. Because again, we were selling those bonds in the most regulated market in the world, the municipal market. And we were complying by the rules. They were all sold by the rules. As I said, to me, this is a structural crisis, not a cyclical crisis. The two crises are intertwined. We have an economic crisis and we have a financial crisis. And the problem is that during the last 10 years, maybe more, when we make decisions to try to correct the budget crisis, we affect the economic situation. And when we try to foster economic development, somehow we affect the budget crisis. So the two are intertwined. As I have said from the beginning, I'm convinced that what I call a new economic relationship has to be established between Puerto Rico and the United States. Yes, that will get into the status issue, and I'm going to talk about that today because it will take forever. But in terms of the crisis, and I know the Department of Treasury is going to be testifying tomorrow, Anthony Weiss. I agree with most of the proposals that the Obama administration is making, but to say that the federal government cannot do anything by themselves, that is only Congress, the one that has the power to act, is not correct. They do have limited powers, but they do have, through the Treasury Department, through the Federal Reserve Bank, they have a way to help short-term Puerto Rico. So in that sense, I hope that tomorrow, at least the door is open, a small door is open, that if we don't get action from Congress, and we need more time, that the executive branch, the Obama administration, will step up using the tools they have under their the federal laws. But it looks like we have a gridlock. I know some people are very optimistic that finally we're going to get something. Maybe I will change my mind tomorrow. But this is what I think are the chances. I think it's 50-50. 50% that nothing is going to be approved. Because there's not going to be agreement among the Republicans, and then whatever agreements they have or enough votes, the Democrats, for good reason, are not going to accept it. So I think it's a 50 chance we won't reach an there won't be an agreement, which then we'll be back here in July with a bigger crisis, a more complicated crisis. And the other 50% is that something is going to be approved, but it's not for the good of Puerto Rico. That we might get something approved, but really that is not for the good of Puerto Rico. Therefore, my theory is that the only way maybe to break that gridlock is to basically make the U.S. Congress, the administration, everyone understand that they not only have a moral and political responsibility, they might have a legal responsibility. And yes, on that, we have to talk about status. It's not that about it. The official position of the executive branch, officially now, but since the times of my friend Jeffrey Farrell, that was the unofficial position. Jeffrey, I remember Eduardo, what's called non-paper paper circulated by the non-paper. Yeah, you remember, you drafted. Circulated by the region of the United States and the United Nations before a hearing on the Decolonization Committee. Eduardo was the first time I went there. The first time I was president of the Popular Democratic Party. So, but now the official. I said, nice to see you. The official position presented before the U.S. Supreme Court in January is that Puerto Rico is still under the plenary powers of Congress, and that really nothing happened in 1952. And that's the same position that the Resources Committee in the House and in the Senate have taken since the 1990s. 1990s. The Young Bill and all that. So what you have now is the official position of the two political branches, which are the ones with Puerto Rico has to deal every time. Congress and the executive branch saying, we have plenary powers over you. And nothing really happened in 1952. Well, if Congress has plenary powers over Puerto Rico, and as I explained to you, the power to impose taxes and the power to sell bonds comes from a federal law, not a typical federal law, and this is also important to explain. Of course, Congress passes laws every day regulating private negotiations, and that doesn't mean that Congress is responsible for whatever one of the parties breach of the contract or whatever. In this case, those were laws passed by Congress under their plenary power to administer the territory. So it's not powers to regulate interstate commerce. It was the powers to regulate the territory. So if the law in which are taxes, the taxes approved by the legislature, the taxes approved by the government of Puerto Rico, the bonds issued by the government of Puerto Rico, if the ultimate source of that power is federal law, if Congress has plenary power, if those bonds, Puerto Rico, if those bonds were sold in the U.S. market with triple tax exemption granted by the federal government, then who is the ultimate responsible for that debt? Very simple. With plenary powers come plenary responsibilities. The official position of the United States in the brief before the Supreme Court is Congress cannot irrevocably cede sovereignty to Puerto Rico while it remains a U.S. territory. Therefore, it's an oxymoron to argue at the same time that they can cede their responsibility over the actions taken by a territory, in this case, the debt of Puerto Rico. Very simple. If you say you have plenary power, and you even say, I constitutionally cannot grant you any kind of sovereignty, how can you say, but I'm not responsible for your actions? I'm not responsible for the consequences of whatever you do with the powers I basically gave you. If Puerto Rico has no sovereignty, then who is responsible for the sovereign debt? That's how it's called. The debt of the central government of Puerto Rico is called sovereign debt, as well as the debt of the state. But if we have no sovereignty, which is the official position of the U.S. government right now, who is the sovereign? If Puerto Rico is merely a territory, therefore, the 72 billion debt is legally a territorial debt. If the Congress Constitution is a mere delegation of powers legislated by Congress in 1952 that can be changed or even eliminated by Congress, and that's the official position, at any time, then who is really the ultimate guarantor of the constitutional debt recognized in Section 8, Article 6 of the Commonwealth Constitution? Again, with plenary powers come plenary responsibility. Just as an example, the revised Organic Act of the Virgin Islands, which is the federal law that regulates the Virgin Islands, does have a provision that says that the U.S. government is not responsible over the liability of bonds issued by the government of Britain. It's there. In the case of Puerto Rico, it's not there. Actually, I don't think that passed constitutional muster because they still have plenary powers over the Virgin Islands. But nevertheless, in the case of Puerto Rico, that language is nowhere in the Federal Relations Act. The ultimate question is, can Congress constitutionally relinquish its responsibility over the territory? It seems that the Department of Justice said just a couple of weeks ago, no. Who then is ultimately responsible for the consequences of the insolvency of a territory? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the insolvency of Puerto Rico. It's not that we're not going to be able to pay 1 or 2 debts. We're talking about insolvency. And on that, I found this case from the United States Supreme Court. It's a case from one. Those who are here lawyers know that it's very difficult to get a case all the way to the Supreme Court. It's unique that Puerto Rico is having 2 cases right now. Well, it's not unique, it's because we have a huge crisis. So I don't know how many cases from one have gone all the way to the Supreme Court. I haven't done that research. But I'm assured you, not too many. So my first reaction when I heard there was a case that the Supreme Court took related to an issue of bonds with Guam, I said, why is this important? The facts are not exactly the same. Basically, there is a provision in the Guam Organic Act that has a debt limitation like the one that is in the, not the same one, but like a similar one that is in the Puerto Rico Constitution. And under that federal law, in order to go to the market, the Attorney General of Guam had to approve or certify that a bond issue was in compliance with that disposition. And there was a political local dispute. The governor was for a small bond. It wasn't issuance, not big numbers. And the Attorney General certified that it did not comply with the law. The Guam Supreme Court solved in favor of the governor, basically saying, yes, you can issue those bonds. The Circuit Court solved in favor of the governor of Guam. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And they go through a discussion about the meaning of that disposition. Then at the end, the Supreme Court, Justice Thomas, basically said, and there's the argument that because this is a local issue, we have to respect the decision of the Guam Supreme Court. And this is the last paragraph. It may be true that we accord deference to territorial courts over matters of purely local concern. This case does not fit that model, however. The debt limitation provision protects both Guamanians and the United States from the potential consequences of a territorial insolvency. Thus, this case is not a matter of purely local concern. If the potential consequences of a territorial insolvency are not a matter of purely local concern, what it is? It's a national interest. It's a national interest. The federal government cannot claim that Puerto Rico is still being and is now subject to the territorial clause of the United States Constitution in order to deny Puerto Rico's power and authority to solve our economic and social crisis, and then turn around and say, well, we have no responsibility over the debt because that crisis is a purely local matter. It's not about denying responsibility. It's not about denying responsibility. That's not the reason I'm here. It's about asserting and reclaiming the legal responsibility of the United States. The legal consequences of having plenary powers is that you have plenary responsibility. And we're not here, I mean, the people of Puerto Rico, the government of Puerto Rico, the friends of Puerto Rico, we are not here begging for help, which somehow has been the language used by many people here. Oh, they misbehave and we have to do something. No, we are basically claiming the responsibility that the United States has over this crisis. If Congress and the executive branch are restating that Puerto Rico is a territory totally dependent on the will of Congress, let us take that argument and turn it around. Then you, the United States, bear full responsibility of the consequences of what happens in Puerto Rico. It's not a matter of goodwill, which is welcome, or good politics, which is more than welcome. It's a matter of legal responsibility. Puerto Rico is not begging for anything. if the United States has not relinquished its sovereign powers over Puerto Rico, not even in the limited manner that was intended in 1952 and that was told to the United Nations, then what we're requesting from the United States is to assume its responsibility. The solution so far, again, I might change my opinion after tomorrow. The solutions so far discussed are to partially revoke the self-government powers that Puerto Rico obtained in 1952 by creating some sort of non-elected financial board to rule Puerto Rico. If there is a problem with democracy, the answer has to be more democracy. But the route being considered by Congress is the opposite. The bold and extreme use of their colonial powers on the territorial clause of the United States Constitution. That's what's in the table. What is in the table? You know, for many years, the governor of Puerto Rico was appointed by the President of the United States. And by the way, that did not mean economic development. We were called the poorest house of the Caribbean while we were under the full plenary powers of Congress. For many years, the laws approved by the Puerto Rico legislature could be vetoed by the President and by Congress. And then in 1952, as part of the policy of more self-government, all that changed. Now what is on the table is to go back to 1917. Because the most important self-government power that you could have, that people can have, is how much taxes I impose upon you and what I do with your money. Remember taxation with no representation? But the other side of taxation with no representation is how you use the money. So here what they are basically apparently saying is we're going to create a board not elected by the people of Puerto Rico, appointed by the President or Congress or God knows by whom, non-Puerto Ricans, and they will have the power to override, to change whatever decisions the government of Puerto Rico, the elected government of Puerto Rico takes. If you don't want to have plenary powers, plenary responsibility, then you need to renounce to your plenary powers. And what I mean is we need to find a solution to the current crisis, short-term and long-term. But if the policy of the United States is to keep Puerto Rico under the plenary powers, then 10 years, let's imagine we solve this crisis. And we're all celebrating. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, there's going to be another crisis. And if they still have plenary powers, it's going to be their responsibility. The answer, again, cannot be to limit and deprive the people of Puerto Rico of the self-government powers we have. The answer cannot be to diminish our democracy. What we need is grant us more powers, not less. Grant us more democracy, not less. Grant us the tools to move forward, because I can assure you that the people of Puerto Rico will move forward. We did it in the past. I can assure you we'll do it again. Thank you.
Governor answer the question, but before, I'd like to recognize Zoe Loughran, a senior member of the Judiciary Committee. She's been here. We're so thankful for her. Let's give her a round of applause. And a longtime friend of Puerto Rico, Javier, and a personal friend of the governor, Javier Becerra, a senior member of the
Questions? Comments?
Thank you very much for a very